America was not born in freedom. It was born on land that already had a memory. Long before the word America meant flags, presidents, or power, this land already knew itself. It knew seasons without clocks. It knew borders without walls. It knew governance without kings. And it knew people. Not scattered tribes wandering aimlessly as old textbooks once claimed, but nations, civilizations, systems of law, diplomacy, trade, agriculture, and philosophy that had been evolving for thousands of years before a single European ship ever cut across the Atlantic. This is where the American story truly begins. Not in 1776, not with muskets and parchment, but in a world that was already whole before it was broken. A continent already alive. 15 to 20 million people lived in North America before 1492. Some historians argue the number was even higher. They lived not as one culture, but as hundreds, each adapted to its land, climate, and spiritual worldview. To the east, dense forests supported the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois, whose political system would later quietly influence the U.S. Constitution. They practiced federalism before the word existed. Independent nations bound by shared law, debate, and consensus. To the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built stone cities carved into cliffs, multi-story dwellings with advanced irrigation systems that made desert land bloom. Along the Mississippi River, the city of Cahokia once rivaled medieval London in population. Massive earthen mounds rose from the plains, aligned with celestial movements. This was not wilderness. This was urban planning. On the Great Plains, societies followed the buffalo with mathematical precision, ensuring sustainability. On the Pacific Northwest coast, tribes built permanent wooden cities, harvested salmon with complex ecological knowledge, and practiced wealth redistribution through ceremonial potlatches. This continent was not empty. It was not waiting. It was already occupied by intelligence, by memory, by law. But history, as it would soon be written, had little patience for such truths. Land without owners, or so they said. To native nations, land was not property. It could not be owned, sold, or conquered. Land was relationship. You belonged to the land, not the other way around. This idea would later collide violently with European legal philosophy, which demanded ownership, borders, and extraction. To European eyes, land without fences looked unused. Land without deeds looked unclaimed. Land without kings looked vulnerable. And vulnerability in the age of empires was an invitation. The first shadows from the east. For generations before Columbus, rumors traveled. Fishermen spoke of land beyond the horizon. Vikings had touched the continent centuries earlier, briefly settling in Newfoundland before disappearing back into legend. But 1492 changed everything, not because Europeans arrived, but because they stayed. What followed was not immediate conquest. It was something more invisible and far more deadly. Disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, illnesses native bodies had never encountered. Without immunity, entire villages collapsed within weeks. Elders died first, taking languages, traditions, and memory with them. Societies unraveled before they ever saw a musket. By the time many Europeans ventured inland, they walked through ghost lands, empty villages, silent fields, and mistook devastation for absence. They told themselves the land had always been empty. That lie would become foundational. Power without crowns. One of the great ironies of American history is this: Some of the democratic ideas Americans would later celebrate were first observed among the people they displaced. The Iroquois Confederacy operated under the Great Law of Peace, a constitution that emphasized balance, representation, and collective decision-making. Leaders were chosen, not inherited. Women held significant political power, including the authority to remove corrupt leaders. Benjamin Franklin studied this system closely. But admiration did not equal respect. Influence did not prevent destruction. Europeans could borrow ideas, but not humanity. Warfare, but with rules. Contrary to myth, native warfare was not endless chaos. It was often ritualized, limited, and governed by cultural law. The goal was rarely annihilation. European warfare, by contrast, was total. Villages burned, crops destroyed, civilians targeted. This difference would prove catastrophic. To native nations, war had limits. To empires, war was a business. Spiritual worlds collide. Native spirituality was rooted in land, ancestors, and cycles. European Christianity arrived with absolutes, salvation or damnation, conversion or death. Missionaries followed soldiers. Conversion was framed as mercy. Resistance was labeled savagery. Children were taken, languages suppressed, ceremonies outlawed. Identity itself became a battleground. The goal was no longer land alone, it was erasure. The silent beginning of American violence. By the early 1600s, long before 13 colonies or declarations, patterns were already set. Treaties signed under pressure, agreements broken when convenient, violence justified as destiny, survival reframed as rebellion. What would later be called manifest destiny was already alive, though it had not yet been named. This land, Europeans believed, was meant for them, and God, they claimed, agreed. History's first American lie. The first great American lie was not about freedom, it was about emptiness. That lie made everything else possible. If no one truly lived here, then no one was displaced. If no one was displaced, then no crime occurred. If no crime occurred, then conquest could be called progress. That logic would echo for centuries. A world about to end without knowing it. Native nations did not know they were living in the final moments of an era. Children played beside rivers that would soon be renamed. Councils met under skies that would soon witness smoke. They could not imagine a future where their descendants would be forced onto reservations, their cultures studied as artifacts, their resistance remembered as footnotes. They could not imagine America. But America was already imagining itself. Without them. Foreshadowing a nation. Before there were colonies, there was collapse. Before independence, there was invasion. Before liberty, there was loss. The United States would one day define itself as a nation born in rebellion against tyranny. But its first exercise of power was against those who had no empire, no navy, no voice in European courts. This contradiction would never disappear. It would only evolve. And as sails grew on the horizon, one truth became unavoidable. The story of America would not begin with freedom, it would begin with replacement. Quote, history would later call it discovery. The people who lived through it called it the end of the world. End quote. When the first European ships appeared on the horizon, they did not arrive like thunder. They arrived like curiosity. Wooden giants floating on water, white sails catching the wind, strange men with metal skins and unfamiliar prayers. For many native nations, these newcomers were not immediately seen as conquerors. They were guests, possibly spirits, possibly traitors, possibly lost. Hospitality was offered. That generosity would soon become the most exploited mistake in American history. The myth of Columbus. Christopher Columbus never set foot on what is now the United States, but his shadow would stretch across the continent like a curse. In 1492, Columbus landed in the Caribbean, believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia. What he actually found was something Europe had been dreaming of for centuries: land, labor, and limitless extraction. Columbus wrote home not about wonder, but about profit. He described the indigenous people as gentle, generous, and, most importantly, easy to control. He noted they had no weapons made of iron. He observed they could be made to work. He spoke openly of slavery. Within months, native people were being rounded up, branded, beaten, and shipped across oceans in chains. This was not misunderstanding. This was strategy. And it worked. God, gold, and glory, the real Trinity. European expansion was never driven by curiosity alone. It was driven by a brutal trinity: gold, wealth to fuel empires; God, justification through religion; glory, power, titles, immortality in history. The New World was not a place to coexist, it was a resource to be consumed. Spain, France, England, Portugal all raced to carve the continent into possessions. They brought flags, priests, soldiers, and lawyers, and with them came a belief that would shape everything that followed. Christian Europeans were superior by divine right. This belief was formalized through doctrines endorsed by the Catholic Church, declaring that lands not ruled by Christians could be claimed, their people subdued, their cultures erased. This wasn't rogue behavior, it was international policy. First contact, first deaths. In the early encounters, violence was sporadic, but disease was relentless. Smallpox arrived like an invisible army. Entire communities collapsed in weeks. Survivors were often too weak to bury the dead. Fields went unplanted. Social structures shattered. Europeans misread this devastation as proof of divine favor. They believed God was clearing the land for them. What they did not see, or chose not to see, was that they were walking through cemeteries. The English arrive, and so does permanence. Unlike the Spanish, who sought gold, or the French, who focused on trade, the English came with something far more dangerous. They came to stay. In 1607, English settlers established Jamestown in Virginia. It was poorly planned, poorly led, and on the brink of collapse almost immediately. They survived not through skill, but through native aid. The Powhatan Confederacy shared food, knowledge, and land. They taught the English how to survive the climate. Without this help, Jamestown would have vanished like so many failed colonies before it. Instead, it survived. And then it demanded more. From guests to claimants. What began as fragile coexistence quickly turned into entitlement. The English did not see land as shared. They saw it as vacant, if not farmed according to European methods. Forests were seen as wasted, rivers as unused, hunting grounds as unclaimed. As settler populations grew, so did their hunger for land, for security, for dominance. Fences went up, farms expanded, villages were pushed back. When native leaders protested, the English responded with treaties, documents written in English, interpreted by colonizers, and enforced at gunpoint. Treaties were signed, treaties were broken, then new treaties replaced them. This cycle would become American tradition. War as policy. By the 1620s and 1630s, violence escalated. In New England, the Pequot War erupted after rising tensions between native nations and English settlers. Entire Pequot villages were surrounded and burned. Men, women, and children killed indiscriminately. Survivors were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. Colonial leaders called it victory. They thanked God. This was not an exception, it was a blueprint. The normalization of massacre. One of the chilling developments of this era was how quickly violence became routine. Colonial governments paid bounties for native scalps. Entire communities were targeted as threats simply for existing near English settlements. Native resistance was labeled savagery. Colonial aggression was labeled defense. Language did the work of morality. Slavery begins here, too. Before African slavery dominated the colonies, native slavery was widespread. Men were forced into labor. Women and children were taken as servants. Some were shipped overseas, never to return. Slavery was not an accident of later capitalism. It was present at the beginning. The idea that human beings could be owned, traded, and exploited became normalized long before America existed as a nation. Religion as a weapon. Missionaries often arrived alongside soldiers. Conversion was framed as salvation, but it came at the cost of identity. Native languages were suppressed. Spiritual practices were banned. Children were taught to reject their ancestors. Those who resisted were punished. Religion provided moral cover for cultural destruction, and destruction, once justified, became easy. A land transformed by force. By the mid-1600s, the eastern coastline had changed forever. Forests cleared, rivers rerouted, native trails became colonial roads, sacred sites became farmland. Native nations were pushed inland, not because treaties demanded it, but because guns enforced it. Each wave of settlers moved the line of civilization westward, leaving displacement behind. The lie becomes history. As generations passed, colonists began telling a different story about their arrival. They spoke of bravery, hardship, and divine mission. They erased the violence that made their survival possible. Children were taught simplified tales, friendly natives, fair trades, inevitable progress. The truth was far more uncomfortable. America's foundation was not cooperation, it was conquest, sanitized by time. Resistance never died. Despite overwhelming odds, native resistance never disappeared. Leaders rose, alliances formed, wars were fought not for power but for survival. But the balance had shifted. European weapons, reinforcements, and endless migration tilted the scales permanently. What native nations faced was not a war they could win, it was replacement, setting the stage for everything that follows. By the end of the 17th century, the patterns were clear. Land taken through force or fraud, violence justified as progress, religion used as authority, law written by the powerful, resistance labeled criminal. These patterns would not end with colonization, they would become American habits. The invasion had a new name now. It was called settlement, and with every ship that arrived, the future of this land grew more certain and more violent, because once a people are declared invisible, everything done to them can be called destiny. A treaty is a promise, until it stands in the way of power. By the early 1700s, native nations had learned a painful truth. European words could not be trusted. Agreements were signed with ceremony, witnesses, and sacred symbols. Hands were shaken, pipes were smoked. Promises were spoken aloud in the presence of elders and spirits. Then, settlers arrived anyway. Fields were cleared, homes were built, soldiers followed. And when native leaders protested, the colonists produced the treaty, the same treaty they were now violating, and claimed it meant something else. This is how law became a weapon in America. The treaty machine begins. Treaties were presented as diplomacy, but they functioned as a system of dispossession. They followed a predictable pattern. Pressure was applied, military threats, starvation, or isolation. A treaty was offered as peace. Land was surrendered in exchange for promises. Promises were broken. A new treaty was offered. Each treaty reduced native land. each treaty increased colonial control. By the time the United States was formed, this machine would be perfected. Allies today, obstacles tomorrow. During conflicts between European powers, native nations were often courted as allies. The British needed them against the French. The French needed them against the British. Weapons were exchanged, alliances were signed. Native warriors fought in wars that were not theirs, hoping loyalty would be remembered. It never was. When wars ended, Native allies were excluded from peace negotiations. Their lands were traded like currency between empires. They learned that in European wars, native blood was cheap, but native land was priceless. The revolutionary betrayal. When the colonists rebelled against Britain, many native nations faced an impossible choice: support the British, who at least restricted westward expansion, or support the colonists who openly hungered for land. There was no good option. Those who sided with the British were labeled enemies of the new United States. Those who aided the colonists were forgotten once independence was secured. Either way, native nations lost. The revolution that promised liberty accelerated their destruction. A new nation, same habits. The United States inherited British attitudes toward native land and intensified them. From the beginning, the federal government recognized native tribes as sovereign nations, but sovereignty came with a catch. It existed only when convenient. Treaties were written in legal language native leaders could not fully read or challenge. Translation was often manipulated. Meanings were twisted. What native leaders believed they were agreeing to and what the U.S. enforced were rarely the same. This was not confusion, it was design. George Washington's Civilization Plan. George Washington condemned native violence. Privately, he advocated policies that would quietly erase native independence. His solution was called civilization. Native people would be encouraged or forced to adopt European farming, dress, religion, and governance. Communal land would be divided into private property. On paper, this looked humane. In reality, it destroyed native social structures and made land easier to seize. Once native people accepted private property, their land could be taxed, foreclosed, or sold, often to settlers. Assimilation became conquest by other means. Andrew Jackson enters the story. No figure embodies American expansion more brutally than Andrew Jackson. A war hero to Americans, a symbol of terror to native nations. Jackson despised native sovereignty. He saw tribes as obstacles to progress and believed their removal was inevitable and justified. When gold was discovered on Cherokee land in Georgia, pressure exploded. The Cherokee had adopted a written constitution, farms, schools, even newspapers. By American standards, they had civilized. It did not matter. The Supreme Court versus the President. In 1832, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Worcester versus Georgia that the Cherokee Nation was sovereign and that Georgia had no right to seize its land. Chief Justice Marshall made the law clear. Andrew Jackson reportedly responded, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." The rule of law ended where expansion began. The Indian Removal Act. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, authorizing the forced relocation of native nations east of the Mississippi to lands in the West. The policy was sold as voluntary. It was not. Treaties were signed under threat. Those who resisted were arrested. Military force followed. Entire nations were uprooted. Homes abandoned, graves left behind. The Trail of Tears. The Cherokee removal stands as one of the darkest chapters in American history. Thousands were forced into detention camps. Families were separated. Supplies were inadequate. The march west took place in winter. Children died from exposure. Elders collapsed on the road. Mothers buried their dead in shallow graves. By the time the journey ended, over 4,000 Cherokee were dead. This was not an accident. It was policy. Other trails, same tears. The Cherokee were not alone. The Muskogee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole were also expelled. Each removal followed the same pattern: treaty under pressure, forced relocation, massive death, settler occupation. The land they left behind became farms, towns, and eventually states. The American dream was built on empty ground. Resistance and erasure. Some tribes fought back. The Seminole Wars in Florida dragged on for years, costing the U.S. millions and humiliating its military. But eventually, resistance was crushed. Others attempted legal resistance. They lost. Some fled. There was nowhere left to go. By the mid-1800s, Native America east of the Mississippi had been dismantled. The reservation system began. The West was supposed to be the end of the line. Reservations were promised as permanent homelands. They were anything but. Often located on undesirable land, reservations were underfunded, controlled by federal agents, and subject to constant reduction. Each discovery of gold, oil, or fertile soil triggered new removals. Permanent was a lie. How America learned to break promises. By the time westward expansion accelerated, the United States had signed and broken hundreds of treaties with native nations. Breaking promises was no longer controversial, it was normal. This normalization of betrayal would later appear in foreign policy, labor rights, civil rights, and beyond. The pattern was set early. The cost of expansion. Native America paid the price so that America could grow, not through accident, not through misunderstanding, through decisions made deliberately, enforced violently, and justified legally. The land was taken, the treaties were broken, and the nation moved on. America called it progress. Native nations called it survival. The two definitions would never align. The colonies were not born equal. They were built to make some men rich and keep most people quiet. By the time 13 British colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast, America was already learning how to tell a comforting story about itself. A story of brave settlers, of hard work, of freedom. But beneath that story lived a harsher truth. Colonial America was never a land of equality. It was a rigid hierarchy, designed, enforced, and protected by power. And most people were not on top. Life in the 13 colonies, the reality. Colonial society was sharply divided. At the top sat wealthy landowners, merchants, and political elites, men with access to land, credit, and law. They controlled colonial assemblies, trade routes, and courts. Below them lived small farmers, artisans, indentured servants, enslaved Africans, native laborers, women, and the poor, most with little political voice and no real protection. Freedom existed, but only for a narrow slice of the population. The rest lived under control that looked suspiciously like the tyranny America would later claim to resist. The myth of religious freedom. Colonial America is often remembered as a refuge for religious liberty. That was only partially true. Puritans fled persecution in England, but once in power, they created their own systems of intolerance. Dissenters were fined, banished, or executed. Quakers were whipped, Baptists jailed. Religious freedom meant freedom for the dominant group, not for everyone. Conformity was enforced in the name of God. Women, invisible but essential. Women formed the backbone of colonial life. They farmed, cooked, raised children, ran households, worked in shops, and survived childbirth at terrifying rates. Yet legally, married women were not considered individuals. Under English common law, a woman's identity merged into her husband's. She could not own property independently, she could not vote, she could not sign contracts. Her labor sustained the colonies. Her voice was erased. Indentured servitude, temporary slavery. Before African slavery fully dominated, the colonies relied heavily on indentured servants. Poor Europeans, often desperate, signed contracts agreeing to years of labor in exchange for passage to America. Many were tricked, coerced, or kidnapped. They endured brutal conditions. Beatings were common. Contracts were extended arbitrarily. Many died before earning freedom. This system created an underclass, armed, angry, and aware of injustice. Colonial elites watched closely. They learned an important lesson. Class solidarity was dangerous. Bacon's rebellion was a warning shot. In 1676, that danger exploded. Nathaniel Bacon led a rebellion of poor farmers, indentured servants, and enslaved people against the colonial elite of Virginia. They were united by shared frustration, land inequality, lack of representation, and constant frontier violence. They burned Jamestown to the ground. For a moment, class lines collapsed, and that terrified the ruling class. Race is invented as control. After Bacon's rebellion, colonial elites changed strategy. Instead of allowing poor whites and enslaved Africans to unite, they created racial divisions. White servants were gradually granted more rights. African laborers were stripped of theirs. Laws hardened racial slavery into permanence. Skin color became a tool of power. Racism was not accidental. It was engineered. This decision would shape America forever. Slavery becomes permanent. By the early 1700s, slavery was legally entrenched. Enslaved Africans were declared property. Their children inherited bondage. Families were sold apart. Resistance was met with torture and death. Plantation wealth exploded, especially in the southern colonies. Northern colonies benefited too. Shipbuilding, insurance, banks, and trade all profited from slavery. The entire colonial economy was connected to chains. Law served power. Colonial courts existed, but justice depended on status. Wealthy colonists rarely faced punishment. The poor were imprisoned for debt. Enslaved people had no legal standing. Native people were excluded entirely. Law did not restrain power, it protected it. This legal culture would later influence the American system itself. Taxes, trade, and control. Britain viewed the colonies as economic assets. Raw materials flowed out, finished goods flowed in. Colonists were forbidden from competing with British industry. Taxes were imposed without colonial representation. This created resentment, but not rebellion yet. Most colonists did not seek independence, they sought inclusion. They wanted a seat at the table, not to overturn it. Who benefited from the empire? The colonial elite often benefited from British rule. They gained protection, trade privileges, and political status. It was small farmers, merchants, and urban workers who felt squeezed, paying taxes while lacking power. This tension would later fuel revolution, but not for moral reasons alone. It was about who controlled wealth. Slaves, natives, and the invisible majority. By the mid-1700s, a majority of people in the colonies were enslaved, indentured, landless, disenfranchised. Yet history would remember the era through the voices of elite white men. The silence of others was not because they had nothing to say, it was because no one recorded it. a society ready to explode. By the eve of revolution, the colonies were a pressure cooker. Inequality rising, land shortages growing, slavery entrenched, native displacement accelerating, political power concentrated. The language of freedom was beginning to spread, but its meaning was still limited. Rebellion was coming, but it would not be fought for everyone. The 13 colonies were not united by liberty, they were united by grievance. And when they finally rebelled, the promise of freedom would be carefully controlled, extended to some, denied to many. The revolution promised freedom. It delivered independence and left millions behind. When Americans look back on the Revolutionary War, they often see a clean story, brave patriots standing up to tyranny, united by ideals of liberty and self-government. The reality was far more complicated. The American Revolution was not a single uprising. It was a civil war, a class struggle, a land grab, and a global conflict happening all at once. And not everyone wanted it. Who really wanted revolution? In the 1770s, only a minority of colonists actively supported independence. Historians estimate about 1/3 were patriots, 1/3 remained loyalists to the British Crown, 1/3 tried to stay neutral. Neutrality, however, was rarely respected. Families were split, neighbors turned on one another, property was seized, suspected loyalists were beaten, exiled, or executed. Revolution was not universally welcomed, it was enforced. The elite's problem with Britain. Colonial elites, lawyers, merchants, plantation owners, had a specific grievance with Britain. They were wealthy, they were educated, they were powerful, but they were not in charge. British taxes, trade restrictions, and royal oversight limited their ambitions. Independence offered something Britain never would: complete control. The revolution was not just about freedom from tyranny, it was about freedom to rule. No taxation without representation, for whom? The rallying cry of the revolution sounded democratic, but representation was never meant for everyone. Voting rights were limited to property-owning white men. Women, enslaved people, Native Americans, and the poor were excluded entirely. The revolution challenged who governed, but not who counted. Slavery and the language of liberty. Perhaps the greatest contradiction of the revolution was slavery. Patriot leaders spoke passionately about freedom while owning human beings. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men were created equal while enslaving over 600 people in his lifetime. This hypocrisy was not lost on the enslaved. When British officials promised freedom to enslaved people who joined the crown, thousands escaped Patriot plantations. To many enslaved Africans, the British looked more like liberators than the revolutionaries did. Black Americans in the war. Both sides recruited black soldiers. Some fought for the Patriots, hoping service would earn freedom. Others fought for the British, who often delivered on their promises, at least temporarily. After the war, thousands of formerly enslaved people left with British forces, resettling in Canada, the Caribbean, or Africa. Those who remained in America often found that independence changed nothing. Freedom was postponed. Native Americans, the losers of independence. For Native nations, the revolution was a disaster. The British had limited westward expansion through the Proclamation of 1763. The Patriots despised this restriction. Native leaders understood the danger. Many allied with Britain, not out of loyalty, but survival. When the Patriots won, they treated native allies of Britain as defeated enemies. Lands were seized, treaties ignored, expansion accelerated. Independence meant invasion. The war beyond the battlefields. The Revolutionary War was brutal. Civilian populations suffered, crops were destroyed, disease spread through camps. Soldiers froze, starved, and deserted in massive numbers. Victory was far from guaranteed. Without French money, weapons, and troops, the revolution likely would have failed. American independence was won with foreign help and foreign debt. The Founding Fathers, men, not myths. The founders were not gods. They were political operators. They argued bitterly among themselves. They feared popular democracy. They distrusted the masses. Many believed too much freedom would lead to chaos. Their goal was not equality, it was stability. And stability, they believed, required control. The Declaration's hidden silences. The Declaration of Independence did something radical. It claimed legitimacy came from the people, but it did not define who the people were. It condemned King George for inciting native savages. It said nothing about slavery. It ignored women completely. Its power lay in what it inspired, not what it practiced. Winning the war, losing the promise. When the war ended in 1783, celebrations erupted. But for many, life grew worse. Loyalists lost land and fled. Native nations lost territory. Enslaved people were returned to chains. Poor soldiers were unpaid. Independence changed the flag, but not the system. A revolution contained. The revolution succeeded because it was limited. It replaced British rulers with American ones, but left economic and social hierarchies largely intact. True equality was too dangerous. The founders had won power, and they intended to keep it. The question that remained. The United States had been born, but it was an unfinished nation, built on ideals it was unwilling to fully honor. Liberty had been declared, equality had been deferred, and the hardest questions had been postponed for another generation. The American Revolution freed a nation. It did not free a people. That struggle was only beginning. We the people was a powerful phrase, precisely because it was never clearly defined. After independence, the United States faced a problem no musket could solve. Winning a war was one thing, building a nation was another. The revolution had destroyed British authority, but it had not replaced it with a stable system. The country was fractured, broke, suspicious of power, and terrified of chaos. What came next would shape American life more than any battlefield victory. A nation on the edge of collapse. Under the Articles of Confederation, the new United States was barely functional. There was no strong executive, no national court system, no power to collect taxes. States behaved like rival countries. Currency varied, debt piled up, veterans went unpaid. Foreign governments doubted America would survive. For the wealthy elite, this instability was frightening. For poor farmers and workers, it was unbearable. Shays' Rebellion, the elite panic. In 1786, desperation exploded in western Massachusetts. Daniel Shays, a former Revolutionary War captain, led thousands of debt-ridden farmers who faced foreclosure and prison. They shut down courts to stop property seizures. These were not radicals, they were veterans, men who had fought for independence. But to the founders watching from their estates, Shays' Rebellion looked like mob rule. The lesson they drew was clear. Too much democracy was dangerous. This fear, not idealism, drove the Constitution. The Constitutional Convention, closed doors, open power. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia. The public believed they were revising the Articles of Confederation. They were not. Behind closed doors, they scrapped the old system entirely and designed a new government, one far stronger, far more centralized, and far more controlled. Ordinary Americans were not present. Women were excluded. Enslaved people were counted but not represented. This was not a democratic assembly. It was a negotiation among elites. We the people, but which people? The Constitution opened with words that sounded revolutionary, we the people of the United States. But in practice, the people meant a narrow group. Voting was left to the states, most of which restricted it to property-owning white men. The majority of the population had no political voice. The Constitution protected property rights far more carefully than human rights. That was not an accident. Slavery, the original sin locked into law. The founders argued bitterly over slavery, but not about whether it was wrong. They argued about how to manage it. Southern states threatened to leave if slavery was challenged. Northern states, benefiting economically, chose compromise. Those compromises were devastating. The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved people as fractions for representation, not rights. The Fugitive Slave Clause required escaped slaves to be returned. The international slave trade was protected for decades. Slavery was not merely tolerated, it was embedded. The Electoral College, fear of the people. The founders distrusted direct democracy. They feared voters could be manipulated. They feared popular leaders. They feared poor people voting against wealthy interests. The Electoral College was designed as a buffer to filter the will of the people through elites. It was not created to expand democracy. It was created to control it. Checks, balances, and control. The Constitution divided power, but not equally. The Senate favored small states. Senators were originally appointed, not elected. The Supreme Court was insulated from public opinion entirely. Every branch contained safeguards, not against tyranny alone, but against popular pressure. The system assumed citizens were dangerous. The Bill of Rights, a promise after protest. Many Americans opposed the Constitution. They feared centralized power. They remembered monarchy too well. Ratification was only possible after promises were made to add protections for individual liberties. The Bill of Rights followed, but even these rights applied unevenly. Free speech did not protect enslaved people. Due process did not apply to native nations. Equality was not guaranteed to women. Rights existed, but selectively. Law as a shield for power. From the beginning, American law reflected priorities: protect contracts, protect property, protect order. Justice for the powerless was secondary. Courts upheld slavery, dispossession, and inequality, often citing the Constitution itself. The law was neutral in language, but never in effect. The American paradox is born. By 1791, the United States had something extraordinary: a nation founded on liberty that legally protected bondage, a government of the people that feared the people, a revolutionary republic that preserved hierarchy. This paradox would define American history. The question no one answered. The founders believed future generations would resolve these contradictions. They believed progress was inevitable. They were wrong. The compromises of 1787 would not fade quietly. They would erupt in blood, in protest, in war. The Constitution created a nation. It did not create justice. That struggle would consume the next century and beyond. Slavery was not a Southern problem. It was the American economy. By the early 19th century, the United States was expanding fast. Westward, upward, outward. Cities grew, trade exploded, industry began to stir. And beneath it all, holding the nation together like a dark engine, was slavery. Not as a side effect, not as a regional flaw, but as a central pillar of American wealth. The myth of the backward slave South. For generations, Americans were taught a comforting idea. Slavery was an inefficient, dying system clinging to the past. The truth was the opposite. Slavery in America was modern, it was scientific, it was brutally efficient. Enslaved people were not only laborers, they were capital. They were insured, mortgaged, used as collateral, traded on credit. This was not feudalism, this was capitalism. Cotton changes everything. In 1793, Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin. Within years, cotton production exploded. What had once been a labor-intensive crop became incredibly profitable. The demand for cotton in British and Northern textile mills skyrocketed, and with it, the demand for enslaved labor. By the 1850s, cotton made up over half of all U.S. exports. Millions of enslaved people worked from dawn to dark. The South became the wealthiest slave society in history. America did not merely tolerate slavery, it optimized it. The domestic slave trade, America's hidden migration. When the international slave trade was banned in 1808, slavery did not decline, it expanded inward. Over 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated from the Upper South to the Deep South. Families were torn apart, children sold away from parents. This internal trafficking rivaled any global atrocity, but happened entirely within U.S. borders. It was legal. It was profitable. It was American. Northern complicity. The North did not need plantations to benefit from slavery. Northern banks financed slave purchases. Insurance companies insured enslaved bodies. Shipyards built slave ships. Factories processed slave-grown cotton. Wall Street rose on slave money. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and other institutions benefited directly from slavery and the slave trade through donors, endowments, and investments. Slavery was national. Life in bondage. Enslaved people lived under constant surveillance and violence. Whippings were routine. Sexual abuse was widespread. Families existed at the mercy of owners. Resistance was met with terror, branding, mutilation, execution. Yet even in chains, enslaved people resisted, slowing work, sabotaging tools, preserving language and faith, escaping when possible. Their humanity survived where law denied it. The lie of paternalism. Slaveholders claimed slavery was benevolent, that enslaved people were cared for, protected, and better off. This lie served two purposes. It soothed moral discomfort, and it justified continued exploitation. The reality was unrelenting brutality enforced by violence and fear. Slavery and politics. Every major political issue in early America revolved around slavery. New states, territorial expansion, trade policy, foreign relations. Compromises were made again and again, not to end slavery, but to manage it. Each compromise delayed conflict and deepened it. Abolitionists, a minority voice. Those who opposed slavery faced ridicule, violence, and censorship. Abolitionist newspapers were destroyed, speakers were attacked, Congress passed gag rules to silence debate. Slavery was not just protected by law, it was protected by force. The psychology of dehumanization. To sustain slavery, Americans had to believe lies. That black people were inferior, that bondage was natural, that freedom would cause chaos. These beliefs were taught, preached, and enforced. Racism was not a byproduct of slavery. It was its justification. The moral debt accumulated. By the mid-1800s, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. A nation built on liberty was chaining millions. A republic preached equality while practicing ownership. This tension poisoned politics, culture, and conscience. Something had to give. The inevitable collision. Slavery was too profitable to surrender peacefully, too cruel to continue indefinitely. America was racing toward a reckoning. It would not be resolved in courts or speeches. It would be decided on battlefields. America had been built on chains, and chains do not break quietly. Every nation tells itself a story about why it went to war. The dead tell a different one. By 1861, the United States was no longer one country in spirit. It was two visions trapped in the same borders. One vision believed human bondage was essential to prosperity and order. The other believed it was incompatible with the nation's future. For decades, politicians had postponed the reckoning with compromises, threats, and half measures. They had run out of time. The war everyone saw coming. The Civil War did not begin suddenly. It arrived slowly, through laws, court rulings, broken compromises, and rising violence. Every attempt to expand the nation westward reopened the same question. Would new land be free or enslaved? Each answer created new enemies. Secession, choice, not accident. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, he had not promised to abolish slavery where it already existed. But slave-holding states did not wait. They seceded preemptively. Their declarations were explicit. Slavery was the reason. This was not about abstract states' rights. It was about property in human beings. Lincoln's dilemma. Abraham Lincoln was not the abolitionist many later imagined. He hated slavery. He feared its expansion, but he prioritized preserving the Union above all else. Early in the war, Lincoln would have accepted reunion without emancipation. That hesitation cost lives, but it also revealed a deeper truth. Even in crisis, America struggled to choose justice over unity. Soldiers without glory. The Civil War was not heroic for those who fought it. It was disease, starvation, fear, and unimaginable violence. Soldiers died not in grand charges, but in muddy fields, screaming hospitals, and mass graves. Modern weapons met outdated tactics. Entire generations were shattered. The civilian toll. Civilians suffered immensely. Cities burned, farms destroyed, families displaced. The war reached into homes, churches, and towns. Total war blurred the line between soldier and civilian. No one was untouched. Emancipation, a turning point. As the war dragged on, Lincoln realized the truth. Slavery sustained the Confederacy. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all enslaved people, it freed those in rebelling states, where Lincoln had no immediate power to enforce it. But symbolically, it transformed the war. Now, the Union fought not just for preservation, but for liberation. Black soldiers enter the war. Nearly 180,000 black men joined the Union Army. They fought bravely, often for lower pay, worse treatment, and no guarantee of freedom for their families. Captured black soldiers faced re-enslavement or execution. They fought anyway. Their service shattered the myth of black inferiority. The Confederate home front collapsed. As the war continued, the Confederate economy collapsed. Food shortages spread, inflation soared. Enslaved people fled plantations by the thousands, destabilizing the labor system. The institution the South fought to protect was unraveling from within. The cost of victory. By 1865, over 600,000 Americans were dead. The Union won. Slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment. But victory did not bring healing. Hatred remained. power structures adapted, justice was incomplete. Lincoln's assassination. Days after the war ended, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. His death removed the one leader capable of guiding the nation through Reconstruction with restraint and resolve. What followed would shape the next century. Freedom arrived on paper. In reality, it arrived late, if it arrived at all. When the Civil War ended, 4 million formerly enslaved people stood at the edge of a new world. They had survived bondage. They had survived war. Now they faced a question no law could immediately answer. What does freedom mean when everything you need to live is owned by someone else? Reconstruction begins with promise. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there was a brief, fragile moment of possibility. The federal government moved to redefine the nation. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment promised citizenship and equal protection. The 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights for Black men. For the first time in American history, equality seemed legally possible. Black Americans built schools, churches, newspapers, and businesses. They voted. They ran for office. It was a revolution in daily life, and it terrified the old power structure. Land, the promise that broke. Freedom without land was a trap. Enslaved people believed emancipation would come with land, famously symbolized by the promise of 40 acres and a mule. That promise was real, and it was revoked. Land was returned to former slaveholders. Black families were left landless, forced into sharecropping and debt. Economic dependence replaced legal bondage. Slavery had ended. Exploitation adapted. Black political power and white panic. During Reconstruction, Black Americans held political office across the South. They passed laws establishing public education, infrastructure, and civil rights. This was the most democratic the South had ever been. It was also the moment white supremacist violence intensified. Terror as policy. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged not as fringe mobs, but as organized political forces. They assassinated Black leaders, burned schools, intimidated voters. Their goal was simple: restore white control by any means necessary. Local law enforcement often participated. The federal government intervened briefly, but its commitment wavered. The North loses interest. Reconstruction required sustained federal enforcement. It required political courage. The North had both, briefly, but as years passed, enthusiasm faded. Economic interests shifted. Racism persisted. White Americans grew tired of protecting Black rights. Unity became more important than justice. The Compromise of 1877. The end came quietly. In a political deal to resolve a contested presidential election, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction ended. Black Americans were left unprotected. This was not a failure of ideals. It was a choice. Jim Crow rises. With federal oversight gone, Southern states moved swiftly. Voting rights were stripped through poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. Segregation was legalized. Violence became routine. The Supreme Court upheld these systems. Equality was declared unconstitutional. Lynching and silence. Thousands of Black Americans were lynched. Public executions, spectacles of terror. The purpose was not justice, it was control, and the nation looked away. A democracy abandoned. By the early 20th century, the promise of Reconstruction was gone. Black Americans were citizens in name, but not in reality. The country had chosen reconciliation with former Confederates over protection of the freed. The war's outcome was hollowed out. The long shadow. Reconstruction's failure shaped everything that followed. Wealth inequality, political exclusion, racial violence. distrust in government. The United States had a chance to become something new. It declined. Slavery was abolished in 1865. Freedom was postponed indefinitely, and the cost of that delay would echo for generations. America did not enter the industrial age by lifting people up. It entered it by grinding them down. As Reconstruction collapsed in the South, a different transformation was taking place across the nation. Smoke rose from factories. Railroads carved the continent. Cities exploded in size. The United States was becoming an industrial power. And once again, the story Americans told themselves was one of progress, innovation, and opportunity. The reality was far darker. The rise of the robber barons. A small group of men accumulated unprecedented wealth. John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan. They were celebrated as captains of industry, visionaries who built America. They also crushed competition, manipulated markets, bribed politicians, and exploited labor. Their fortunes were not accidents. They were engineered. Monopolies and control. These men did not compete. They eliminated rivals. Standard Oil controlled nearly 90% of American oil. Railroads set prices that favored friends and punished enemies. Steel trusts dictated wages and working conditions. The free market existed in theory. In practice, power decided everything. Workers disposable and silent. Industrial labor was brutal. Men, women, and children worked 12 to 16 hours a day. Factories were unsafe. Injuries were common. Deaths were routine. There were no safety regulations, no benefits, no minimum wage. If you were injured, you were replaced. Poverty was not a failure. It was policy. Child labor and human cost. Children worked in mines, mills, and factories. They were small enough to fit into dangerous spaces. They were cheap. They were silent. Their suffering fueled American prosperity. Photographs of child labor would later shock the nation, but at the time, they were normal. Immigration, the new labor pool. Millions of immigrants arrived from Europe and Asia. They were promised opportunity. They found exploitation. They lived in overcrowded tenements, worked the worst jobs, and faced violent discrimination. Their labor built cities. Their humanity was ignored. Strikes and bloodshed. Workers resisted. They organized unions. They demanded shorter hours, safer conditions, and fair pay. The response was violent. Strikes were crushed by private militias, police, and federal troops. Workers were beaten, jailed, and killed. The state sided with capital. Pullman, Haymarket, Homestead. Each major strike ended the same way. Workers lost, corporations won. Violence was justified as order. Labor rights were treated as rebellion. The myth of the self-made man. The robber barons claimed their wealth was the result of hard work and genius. They ignored inherited privilege, public subsidies, exploited labor, and political corruption. The myth of the self-made man became American gospel. It obscured exploitation and blamed the poor for their own suffering. Philanthropy as image control. Later in life, many industrialists gave away fortunes, libraries, universities, museums. Their generosity softened their image, but did not erase how their wealth was created. Charity became a shield against accountability. The Gilded Age illusion. The era glittered with wealth for the few and misery for the many. Inequality soared. Democracy weakened. Corporate power replaced aristocracy, but not oppression. Seeds of reform. Yet resistance did not die. Journalists exposed corruption. Reformers demanded regulation. Workers continued organizing. The fight for dignity was not over, but it would take decades and enormous sacrifice before the balance began to shift. America had become rich, but it had not become just, and the cost of that imbalance would soon crash the system itself. Empires rarely announce themselves. They insist they are only protecting freedom. By the end of the 19th century, the United States faced a new problem. The frontier was closing. Factories were overproducing. Capital needed new markets. At home, inequality simmered. Abroad, opportunity beckoned. America was about to step onto the world stage, not as a former colony, but as a rising empire. The war that changed everything. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain. Officially, it was about liberating Cuba from oppression. Unofficially, it was about power. Newspapers inflamed public anger with sensational stories. The explosion of the USS Maine, never conclusively explained, became a rallying cry. Remember the Maine. The war lasted only months. The consequences would last a century. Victory and spoils. When the war ended, Spain was defeated. The United States gained control of Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. Cuba became nominally independent under American oversight. This was not liberation, it was acquisition. The Philippine War, America's forgotten conflict. Filipinos had fought Spain for independence. They expected freedom. Instead, they got new rulers. When Filipinos resisted American control, the U.S. responded with overwhelming force. Villages were burned, civilians killed, torture was used. Over 200,000 Filipinos died. American leaders called it benevolent assimilation. History largely forgot it. Racism goes global. The same beliefs used to justify native removal and slavery were exported overseas. Non-white populations were deemed incapable of self-government. Empire was framed as responsibility. Power dressed itself as morality. The open door and corporate interests. America demanded access to foreign markets, especially China. The open door policy was presented as fairness. In practice, it ensured American corporations could compete globally, protected by military force if necessary. Economic power followed the flag. The Panama Canal, engineering and coup. To control global trade routes, the United States needed a canal. Colombia resisted. So, America supported a rebellion in Panama, then immediately recognized the new country and secured canal rights. It was not diplomacy, it was leverage. The Monroe Doctrine evolves. Originally defensive, the Monroe Doctrine became a tool of intervention. The U.S. intervened repeatedly in Latin America to protect investments, influence governments, and suppress movements deemed hostile. Democracy was optional. Stability for American interests was mandatory. America redefines itself. By 1900, the United States was no longer pretending to avoid empire. It justified expansion as progress, civilization, and destiny. Critics warned it betrayed Republican ideals. They were ignored. The cost of empire. Overseas expansion required military growth, permanent bases, interventionist policy. America was changing internally as well. Foreign power required domestic control. The double standard. America condemned European imperialism while practicing its own. It preached self-determination while denying it abroad. This contradiction would shape U.S. foreign policy for generations. America had crossed a line. It would never fully step back. From this point forward, the United States would measure its strength not just at home, but across the world.